Great. Good morning, everyone, and good evening. I'm Chris Johnstone. I'm the Senior Advisor and Japan Chair here at CSIS in Washington. And welcome to everyone to our webinar on Politics and Policy, Japan's Road Ahead on National Security and Economic Strategy. We're very pleased that all of you could join us wherever you are today. This is an exceptionally consequential time in Japan's political scene, with major decisions ahead on both the national security and the economic policy front. So it's really a perfect time for an in-depth discussion of the issues on the plate and the road ahead. I'll introduce our speakers, our really terrific panelists, in just a minute, but I want to offer a few framing remarks up front before we get into the discussion. So on the national security side, in a few weeks, the government of Prime Minister Kishida is preparing to release 3 key strategic documents: a new national security strategy, the first since 2013 and only the second ever, a new national defense program guidelines, which may be renamed the National Defense Strategy, and an accompanying procurement plan, which could have a 10-year horizon over it rather than the typical tradition of a 5-year Chukibo. And it appears from what we are seeing in the media that these documents may include a number of groundbreaking, indeed really unprecedented policy announcements. It appears that the government could announce plans to increase defense spending to as much as 2% of GDP by 2027, essentially doubling the level of the defense budget today. A decision to potentially acquire counterstrike capability in the form of long-range precision cruise missiles. Again, an unprecedented capability for Japan. And the Kishida government is exploring steps to strengthen Japan's defense industry at home as well. On the economic front, Japan faces growing inflation, rising at the fastest rate in 40 years, and a significantly weakened yen, although it has recovered somewhat in the last few weeks. The Kishida government is pushing through a $200 billion economic package to cushion the effects of inflation. But at the same time, the government has yet to define the new form of capitalism that Prime Minister Kishida heralded when he first took office just over a year ago. As Prime Minister Kishida wrestles with this truly ambitious agenda, he confronts an increasingly challenging political environment. And that's the backdrop for our discussion today. His approval ratings have collapsed, really, since the upper house election in July, falling into the mid-30s in most polls, close to the traditional danger zone for Japanese prime ministers. The absence of a clear alternative may be the only thing keeping him in place, perhaps, but we'll discuss a bit about that as we get into the discussion. And his cabinet is beset by scandal, with 3 ministers resigning in the last month: the Minister for Internal Communications, the Economic Vitalization Minister, and the Justice Minister, all stepping down as a result of campaign finance irregularities, ties to the Unification Church, and other sorts of issues. So that's a lot of political turmoil at an important time. And so the questions for us here today are: what impact will it all have on Japan's important policy agenda, if any, on both the national security and the economic policy front? Will it have any material impact on these debates? Is Kishida himself in any danger in the near term? And to help us think through these and other questions, I'm really delighted to be joined by 2 terrific, distinguished guests. Hiroyuki Akita, a commentator at Nikkei, is one of Japan's leading analysts of Japanese politics and foreign policy. He writes regularly commentaries and columns and analysis, mainly on foreign and international security affairs. He joined Nikkei in 1987, worked at the political news department, where he covered Japanese foreign and security policies and domestic politics. He was senior and editorial staff writer, and he was Beijing correspondent and Washington chief correspondent, which I think gives him a really unique and unusual perspective on issues related to Japan-China relations and U.S.-China relations and the implications for the alliance. So delighted to have Akita-san with us here tonight. Also joining us is Shihoko Goto, who is the Director of Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director for the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. She specializes in trade relations and economic issues across the Indo-Pacific, and is also focused on the political developments in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. She is also a columnist for the Diplomat magazine and a contributing editor to The Globalist. And prior to joining the Wilson Center, she was a financial journalist covering the international political economy with a focus on Asian markets. So really terrific to have both of them with us here today. I'll invite each of them to make some initial remarks to set the stage for us. We'll then engage in a bit of a dialogue here among the three of us, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We ask that audience members submit their questions throughout the event. I know we already have some in hand, and you can do so through the link on our event page, or if you are tuning in via YouTube, you can find the link in the description box below. So with that, let me turn first to Akita-san to get us started, please.
Hi, everybody. Good morning and good evening. Thank you very much for having me today. And today's topic is very easy if Japanese Prime Minister were to be Mr. Abe. No risk to predict anything. But today, under Kishida administration, maybe predicting a Japanese political landscape next year is almost like predicting weather a year from now. But at least I think I can safely make 3 points. First point is about the direction of Japanese security policy in coming years. And second is about the impact of Kishida administration's prospect on Japanese security policy. And thirdly, and lastly, is about the prospect of Kishida administration itself. So first, direction of Japanese security policy in coming years. As Chris noted, Japan is about to make a huge landmark decision. In short, it is the biggest military or defense capability expansion after World War II. And I think that that direction will not change whoever become a prime minister, or whatever happened to Prime Minister Kishida this year, next year. Because, namely, Japan will keep increasing defense budget, maybe double within 5 years by reaching 2% of GDP, maybe within 5 years or a bit later. And also Japan will keep enhancing security cooperation with the US, but also reaching out to like-minded countries like Australia, UK, France, India, and also Vietnam or other European countries. And Japan will keep doing so regardless what will happen to Japanese politics. Japan will keep doing so because not because Japan desperately love those options, but there are not any other alternative options for Japan because of the deteriorating geopolitical situation. Japanese geopolitical location is the worst, I would say, in the world. Japan is surrounded by China, Russia, and North Korea. And North Korea now deployed nuclear missiles that can hit Japan. And US-China's military balance of power had already shifted to the Chinese favor very drastically. And also on the top of that, Russian military is becoming more and more active and assertive, especially after Russian invasion to Ukraine. So in this context, Japan doesn't have any other option than pursuing more robust military build-up and also increase the defense capability. independently, but also together with the US. So this is my first point. But second point, impact of Kishida administration's prospect on its security policy direction or security policy. As I mentioned, I do not think that the direction of a security policy I don't think it will change. But Kishida's political leadership will largely affect to the pace of evolution of Japanese defense strategy or policy. And because Japanese defense policy evolution that will about to happen now requires very strong political leadership to push forward. For example, maybe incoming national defense guideline and also national security strategy. Japan is likely to focus more on the defense of Okinawa Islands chain. That is most vulnerable, especially to the in the case of Taiwan contingency, but also most vulnerable to China's military expansion. So Japan have to, or self-defense forces will have to deploy more military assets, including missiles or other strike capability, and also have to build military infrastructure to store more missiles and ammunition. In order to get political support from Okinawa prefecture, Kishida Prime Minister has to conduct strong political leadership. So if Kishida's popularity will decline, thereby, so that Kishida's political leadership will decline, it's going to be more difficult to persuade public in Okinawa. And also, but I do not think that even if Kishida's political leadership will decline, Japan still will keep expanding defense budget, but the pace of that expansion of defense budget may be also get affected by the Kishida's leadership. There is an in-battle going on still today between Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Defense or Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Premier Office over the how to find the budget to increase defense budget. Tax increase or more government issuing more government bond or cut other budgets. So Kishida really needs to conduct strong leadership to come up with the consensus. So in short, I think that Kishida's popularity and also support from the public will affect not to the direction of Japanese defense policy, but the pace about how fast Japan will be able to move toward the right direction. So this is my second point. And then last point, prospect of Kishida administration itself. So nightmare is that Japan will go into another revolving door politics. That is from 2006 to 2012, Japanese prime minister change every year. So when Kishida, as Chris mentioned, Kishida's popularity has been declining. Now it is, according to Nikkei poll, recent poll, it is 37% supportive rate. But I do not think that revolving door situation will happen again because of the three reasons. First, Japanese ruling party, Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, now enjoys about 40% of support from the public, according to a poll. latest poll, while biggest opposition party, Constitutional Democratic Party, enjoys just 10%, 1/4. During revolving door nightmare period, popularity supportive rate for LDP and opposition party were almost same. So that is one big difference. Another big difference is that LDP now controls both lower and upper house in the diets. In the revolving door era, LDP only controlled lower house, but the upper house was controlled by opposition party. So it was very, very difficult for first Abe administration or Fukuda administration or Aso administration to pass any important legislation. So it's stacked. So this is a second difference. The third difference is that whether it is good or not, there aren't any strong contender as of today. I'm not so sure about next year or 2 years from now. Maybe people say Mr. Motegi, current LDP Secretary General, or Mr. Taro Kono, former foreign minister, as a potential contender, but not strong enough. I don't think they are ready to replace Mr. Kishida. So because of these three reasons, I don't think that Kishida will resign soon, and Japan will go back to a revolving door politics again. But so based on that, lastly, I will mention reasonable prediction and optimistic and pessimistic scenario. So reasonable prediction is that Kishida will successfully revise national security strategy and national defense guideline next month. And then he will stay as a prime minister and at least until late May next year. And then when he will host G7 summit in Hiroshima, and then try to make some political legacy as a prime minister. So this is very modest, but the reasonable prediction. Then optimistic scenario after that is that he will resolve diet, lower house, and snap election. And maybe he will not be able to win overwhelmingly, but he will not lose. Then I think that it is more likely that he will stay as a prime minister beyond September 2024, when his current tenure as LDP president will expire. But it is likely he will get re-elected if he will be able to win or will not get defeated. So this is cautiously, quite optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is opposite. He will not be able to snap election, even after his Hiroshima G7 summit, because his popularity is so low. Then sooner or later, within the LDP, there will be some revolt or some kind of some move to try to replace prime minister. Or another pessimistic scenario is that he will snap election, but he will not be able to win. He will lose. Under this scenario, he will be forced to resign next year after the election. But I think that lastly, I don't think that he will snap election if he knows that he will lose. So first pessimistic scenario is likely under the worst situation. Thank you.
Akita-san, thank you. You put a lot on the table, as I expected that you would. Your points about the structural factors driving Japan's national security policy likely to sustain the trajectory, but the importance of leadership in affecting the pace. And I'm sort of assured a bit by your assessment of the political environment that perhaps there's more grounds for optimism about stability in the near term. That was terrific. Thank you very much. Shihoko, over to you for your take on the economic issues on the plate.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me to share the panel with Akita-san. It's really a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. Akita-san started his comments about the challenges of predicting the political landscape. The economic landscape, of course, is similarly difficult to predict, but I'd like to start with what hasn't changed. And what hasn't changed is the US expectations for Japan when it comes to economic leadership. It's actually intensified, and it's intensified firstly by looking to Japan as a partner to push back against Chinese economic coercion and Beijing's weaponization of its economic hegemony, especially in the Indo-Pacific. The United States is also looking to Japan as an ally to bring more countries in alignment with the United States in its vision of a revised standing of globalization. And Washington is also looking to Japan to play a key role in the Indo-Pacific and shaping the emerging economic order to promote and protect innovation and new rules, especially in tech governance. And when we look to the Kishida administration, there is a continuum in promoting the vision that Prime Minister Abe had promoted, that is to say, Japan's partnership with the United States remains key to its future stability and prosperity. But at the same time, Japan continues to have a very pragmatic approach to meet its own economic needs. The challenge looking forward is whether Japan can actually continue its economic leadership momentum that it had assumed after the United States left the TPP. And now there are new concerns emerging about the adaptation of the United States of de facto industrial policy and economic rulemaking efforts, especially in the technology sphere. To meet these challenges, the Japanese economy really does need to remain strong. The Japanese economy needs to remain strong for the popularity or the stabilization of the Kishida administration. But it's not just a domestic issue. A stable, prosperous Japan is necessary for the world economy, which is really facing a lot of challenges ahead. We know that the IMF is projecting Japan's GDP growth this year to reach 1.7%, which is actually lower than the 2.4% that is projected for advanced economies at large. But it's expected to be at 1.6% in 2023, which is slightly better than the 1.1% that is projected for advanced economies by the IMF. Of course, Japan is not alone in facing significant stressors to growth. We are anticipating across the world an economic slowdown, confronting high inflationary pressure and higher costs of living as a result. But Japan may be facing some unique challenges. And all eyes are on the economic strategy for Japan's longer term 5-year plan, which is expected to be revealed next month. The domestic challenges, some of them far predate COVID and the current Kishida administration. There are structural challenges to the Japanese economy with essentially the failure of Abenomics to really take root. Some of the issues obviously remain Japan's high debt to GDP, an aging population, and social challenges really to encourage efficiency and competitiveness. But at the same time, we are now facing new challenges, not least, as has been mentioned already, the weakening of the Japanese yen. It is up from the previous lows, but it's still weak. And we've seen already the limits of unilateral intervention in the foreign exchange markets, and there are no expectations for coordinated efforts to support the yen. It is seen that the yen's weakness actually reflects some of the weaknesses, fundamental weaknesses in the Japanese economy. Of course, currently we are focused on the interest rate differential between Japan and the rest of the world. And the Bank of Japan is not expected to raise interest rates in line with other central banks, including the Federal Reserve, amid Japan's own concerns about pressure on borrowing costs that could hurt domestic businesses and households even further. But we also need to recognize that the continued weakness in the yen is hurting Japanese consumers who are particularly hard hit by higher food and energy costs as a result. Another new challenge that Japan is facing is, Akita-san mentioned this briefly, but paying for these defense costs. Yes, Japan is facing new geopolitical pressures and is projected to beef up its own military capabilities, unprecedented since the end of World War II. Japan will be releasing a supplementary budget later this week, but at the end of the day, how is the Japanese government actually going to be paying for all of this? What is the cost of cutting spending? What is the political cost of increasing taxes and taking on even greater debt? And these are all issues that will be a tremendous challenge for the Kishida administration to deliver on its promises to beef up its military presence. And then we also have the emergence of an economic security legislation that was introduced earlier this year. And it was actually released before Japan's unveiling of its broader national security strategy. It's important to emphasize that the economic security legislation really focuses on the latter part, that is to say, the security element. And it really is about building up domestic resilience to disruptions and also to push back against economic coercion by China. But it's also essentially efforts to coordinate and harmonize standards when it comes to defense technology. I'd like to conclude my opening remarks by mentioning briefly the whole discussion about the Kishida administration's foray into new capitalism. The idea of new capitalism, quite frankly, spooked financial markets worldwide. But I would argue that it's actually less a vision for growth, even though it has made overtures to talk about it being a vision to encourage innovation, encouraging startups to flourish as an engine of growth, establishing funding to the tune of $75 billion by establishing a university fund to invest in stocks and bonds that would reinvest into universities for funding in key areas like AI and biotechnology. But new capitalism really isn't answering Japan's fundamental economic challenges that it is facing today. That is to say, the yen's weaknesses, inflation risks, or boosting Japan's supply chain. But I would argue that new capitalism is more of a vision about a Japanese vision for inclusion, and it's a domestic social agenda that potentially could dovetail nicely with the US focus on values. So the Biden administration is being attacked for focusing too much on democracy, which actually can be a divisive factor in the Indo-Pacific, especially in Southeast Asia. But it's clear that the United States needs allies and partners in the region in light of the competition with China. Right now, that competition with China has been narrowly defined by the tech war between China and the advanced economies. But we can expand that strategic competition to talk about the conflict of values, right? And why, and we can see it as an opportunity to talk about why governments with good governance can be more attractive. And the idea of new capitalism that has been floated by the Kishida administration can really highlight the dangers of income equality and the social disturbances that it could create. And that kind of approach to new capitalism, focusing on that social inclusion aspect, could actually resonate with many beyond Japan's borders and connect in a way that the United States has really found challenging when it tries to promote values outside of its own borders too. So let me leave it at that for now.
That's great, Shihoko. Thanks very much. Those were, just as they were with Akita-san, terrific comments. The importance of Japan's leadership on global economic issues, this interesting dynamic between the United States and Japan on trade policy, tech policy with respect to China, and then your comments about new capitalism, which I do want to come back to. So terrific set of remarks. Let me just start with a question or two from me on this question of the defense budget and the prospect, and this question of how to pay for it. Akita-san, you noted the intense debate internally between the Ministry of Finance and others about tax increases, spending cuts, that sort of thing, and the importance of Prime Minister Kishida's role in resolving all of this. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you see this playing out. I know the experts panel that Ambassador Sasai chairs advocated quite strongly for tax increases, but my understanding is that there's been something of a backlash to that recommendation. So interested in how you see that playing out. And Shihoko, you identified this as well. I wonder if there's a risk of Japan's economic and national security policies working at cross purposes here. Is this the right time to be thinking about tax increases to support this national security agenda in an environment where Japan is confronting these economic headwinds? Be interested in just any thoughts you may have on that question or issues related to it. Let me start with Akita-san.
Thank you very much. That is a very crucial and a difficult question, because I was meeting some officials today in Kasumi, and he told me that even today there is a fierce battle over the defense budget, especially about how to pay for that. So, but my prediction is this. Taxing, maybe it is politically very difficult to finance it only by tax increase from the next year. Politically, it is very painful, and Kishida's popularity maybe will not allow that. So maybe compromise will be they will increase tax, or they will commit to increase tax from the fiscal year of 2024, and then as a tentative measure, they will issue government bond to finance defense budget increase only for next year, and then commit to increase tax. Maybe they will leave it vague, or they will commit to specific tax increase, and then increase tax, expand the defense budget. So that is one compromise. But in case they will commit a specific tax increase, possibly from 2024, I think corporate tax and income tax will be the options, because increasing consumption tax is so politically, it is so unpopular because it will, affect everybody. So that is one prediction. And another prediction that is more safe prediction, that is maybe the government will try to broaden the definition of defense budget by including Coast Guard or some R&D budget in other ministries, but that could be a dual use. Currently, Japan's defense budget does not include those budget, but Japan will broaden the definition. And they say it is a NATO criteria. If Japan adapts to a NATO criteria, maybe Japanese defense budget will increase from today. So by mixing these two compromise or tactical, measure, they will somehow increase defense budget with the aim that will achieve 2% of GDP within 5 years. Thank you.
Interesting, Akita-san. So a mix of bonds in the near term, tax increases beginning in 24, and then some budgetary tricks, if you will, that help to get the overall budget to 2%. Yeah. Interesting picture. We'll see how that plays out. Shihoko, any thoughts that you may have on this?
Yeah, the good news, yes, is that when the idea of increasing Japan's defense budget to 2% from 1% came about, there wasn't really much opposition at all. And that kind of approach would have not been possible even a few years ago. And it's a reflection of the understanding by Japanese policymakers as well as the Japanese voters that the reality that Japan faces, the geopolitical situation in Northeast Asia has changed significantly, so it does need to increase its own defense capabilities. So that's the good news. So Akita-san talked about some of the tax increase possibilities. What he did not mention was tax spending cuts. And right, so tax increases are very unpopular, but spending cuts are incredibly unpopular too. And when we look at Japan's demography, with the rapidly aging population, the social spending costs to support that aging population is tremendous. And regardless of whatever efforts the Kishida administration may take to improve the situation, it's demography, right? You can't speed it up. So the number of taxpayers, the tax-paying base, is not going to increase for individual tax payment. So it is difficult to have, at the individual level to increase taxes, but at the same time trying to promote spending cuts. And when you look at it from a US perspective, there are many, Japan is a very, very generous state, right? And so if you took the US approach of less spending on healthcare, less spending on, you get tax credits for child support in Japan, private education is really very affordable, all these things. If they were to be cut, there would be uproar across Japan, and quite frankly, Japan, the nature of Japan would change as well. So there is that challenge. So I do think that when we talk about Japan beefing up its defense spending, what Akita-san talked about being creative on how we define what that spending is going to be critical. And I do think this idea of spending more on research and spending more on innovation and having the benefit of the military industrial complex that Japan really is trying to enhance could match, align more greatly with some of the economic security agenda that the Kishida administration is trying to adopt as well.
Yeah, that's well said, Shihoko. There is a nexus between the economic security agenda and some of what we're likely to see in the going forward in the efforts to strengthen the defense industrial base and improve Japan's sort of defense-related technology. So that's very well said. Let me ask you both maybe a bit about China policy. Akita-san, we talked about the geopolitical environment that's driving Japan's national security strategy. At the same time, Prime Minister Kishida recently met with Xi Jinping. The government speaks in terms of seeking a constructive and stable relationship with China. Interested in how you see, and the economic relationship, obviously, between Japan and China remains extremely important. Wondering how you see this balance playing out going forward. Shihoko, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well. But in addition, particular question we have from one of our audience members, Tammy Overbay at the Albright Stonebridge Group. This question of U.S. export controls on semiconductors and semiconductor-related technology. Interested in your perspective on how Japan is reacting to that and the prospect for it following suit with its own sorts of controls on technology and exports in this sector. Thanks. Maybe this time, Shihoko, if it's okay, I'll start with you.
So let me address this issue of export controls. So this was introduced in October 7th as part of as part and parcel of the U.S. CHIPS and Innovation Act that was introduced during the summer. It has been seen essentially as a declaration of war, of economic war by the United States. And until then, until I think October 7th, it was easier for Japan to not have to pick sides and that it could continue to have a fairly solid economic relations with China whilst maintaining good relations with the United States. The export restriction policies, which currently are in the semiconductor sector, is expected to move into other key technology sectors as well. For Japan, this is going to be reflected in its broader national economic security strategy. And the corporate answer to this is that Japan really doesn't have any option but to abide by some of the direction that the United States is taking. But at the same time, there is a greater push for Japan to be part of that decision-making process within the United States. So if the end goal of the United States is to ensure that there is more buy-in from allies and partners, because the US on its own cannot be successful in hampering technology transfer, advanced technology transfer to China. So buy-in from Japan, buy-in from Korea, buy-in from Taiwan, other countries, other governments is going to be critical. So, but at the moment, it is a very difficult stage for the private sector to follow suit on this.
Yeah, this is really, I think, emerging as one of the key issues in the relationship between us going forward, is this question of the technology relationship with China and how to manage that and how to stay on the same page as allies. So terrific points. Akita-san, interested in your perspective on Japan-China relations.
Okay, thank you very much. So essentially, the goal of Japanese-China policy is to achieve long-term cold peace. No Cold War, no hot war, but do not expect that Japan and China will go back to a friendly partnership. And I think that China understands also that is a reality. So that this meeting is the beginning of that steps, mutual step. Concretely speaking, the biggest deliverable, biggest result of the Xi Jinping and the Kishida's meeting on November 17 in Bali was that they agreed to establish defense hotline And then after 5 days from that meeting, China agreed to hold a maritime talks at the Director General level, and they agreed to activate defense hotline from next spring. So I think that because now U.S.-China is engaging long-term strategic competition, and China of course knows that Japan will stay as a close ally to U.S. China does not expect that Japan will drift away from U.S. and become a close partner, or try to choose in between, position. So again, the goal of Beijing and Tokyo, common goal, is similarly to U.S.-China, to establish guardrail so that this bilateral relation will maintain as kind of like a stable, cold peace relationship for long term. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Was definitely struck by the agreement to establish the hotline. Hopefully it will be more useful than the hotline has proved to be in the US-China context, which my understanding is it often it's not picked up at the other end. So hopefully Japan has a different experience. Let me go back for a second on domestic politics, if I could. Akita-san, interested in what is the role that Commentator is playing on some of these debates, particularly as I think about the strike, the Hangeki no Ryoko counterstrike debate. No matter how you look at this is an unprecedented threshold capability, I would argue, fundamentally different from the kinds of things Japan has had before. Yeah. And I would think pretty at odds with Commentator's longstanding positions on Japanese defense policy. What role are they playing in this national security debate right now?
Yeah, actually, I've been following Commentator's position also in the context of Japanese defense security strategy for many years. And I'm being surprised because in past, Commentator played a role as a brake a step on the brake to slow down put the order on debate in LDP so that LDP will not move too fast to enhance defense capability, especially strike capability. But this time, Commentator seemingly more or less accommodate LDP's direction, that is to acquire a counter-strike capability, and also Commentator does not oppose the biggest defense budget expansion after World War II. But Commentator Commentator emphasized that in order to continuously increase the defense budget, government have to find permanent source of common source of budget, which means tax increase. So by saying it, I think that Commentator tried to slow down the pace of defense budget increase effectively, but the Commentator has changed, and the reason why is interesting. As I understand, young generation in the Commentator supporters, there is a change of security perception. They are more, young generation, not only Commentator supporters, but in general, maybe Japanese young generation are more worried about security prospect, right? They have to keep living in this island for many years. So they worry about the North Korea situation. They worry about the US-Taiwan tension in Taiwan Strait. So Commentator's young supporters wants to Commentator to be responsible or more pragmatic on the defense policy. So I think that reflects in the change of Commentator's position to be more reasonable. Thank you.
Interesting. So generational change affects Komeito too. Fascinating. Great. Shihoko, and by the way, I'm sort of blending some questions we're getting from the audience here. I want to come back to you on this whole issue of the new form of capitalism, and maybe ask you to sort of say, to the extent you can, what it actually is. So a year or so ago in January, the first meeting between Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden, virtual meeting at the White House, that I sat in on, Prime Minister Kishida framed the new form of capitalism as having a lot in common with President Biden's own economic agenda. This idea of ensuring that a wider spectrum of society benefits from economic growth, distributing the gains more comprehensively. So he focused very much on this idea of equality, distribution, and sort of mirroring the president's economic policy for the middle class rhetoric. But lately, we don't hear that rhetoric from Prime Minister Kishida in his descriptions of the new form of capitalism. So frankly, I'm confused about what it is, and I wonder if you have any more clarity that you could offer. I mean, in fairness, the Prime Minister and the government has been, I think, focused on the near-term issues of inflation and Yasu and those sorts of things. But there is this longer-term question: what is the long-term economic agenda? Welcome any thoughts.
Yeah, so I think you're quite right. It hasn't been, the whole idea of new capitalism hasn't really been floated in recent months, because there are so many pressing immediate economic concerns that Japan and indeed the world is facing. The idea of new capitalism, in a nutshell, they talk about a virtuous cycle of growth, right? So, and this virtuous cycle of growth would actually not sacrifice, leave no one behind. And I would say it was more of a reflection of Japanese values. So it would be values-led growth. And that is not to say that there is no space for the new capitalism vision. It doesn't answer to the issue of supply chain resiliency. It doesn't answer to the question of pushing back against Chinese economic coercion and the like. But it does answer to a lot of questioning that Akita-san talked about, the younger generation. I think there is a lot of societal frustration about the limit of globalization. We are on the cusp of reimagining globalization. When we talk about it from a strategic competition perspective, it is about not necessarily decoupling from China, but bifurcating from China. But globalization, reassessing globalization also means, how do you invest in back home? Reshoring, not just for supply chain resiliency, but also reinvesting in human capital. And I do think this idea of investing in people, in the workforce, is something that actually is a borderless challenge. And it is an issue that Japan can actually, if done right, could lead the world in saying that you don't have to be a socialist country, but you can have a world where there is stakeholder capitalism, but at the same time you grow that network of stakeholders. But quite frankly, this is not the time for Kishida to be having this debate, especially when his popularity is low and the double whammy of the economic pressures that the government is currently facing.
Great, thank you for that. Those are, again, terrific points. Let me do just one more question before we wrap here. And again, I'll come back to China-related issues. In particular, the question of Taiwan. Maybe for Akita-san, I wonder if you could share with us how you think Japan views, as it develops this national security strategy, thinks about requirements over the coming years. How does it think about a conflict? How is Tokyo thinking about the possibility of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait? and the role that Japan might play in such a conflict? How is that sort of guiding thinking on the national security strategy? And for Shihoko, related to that, I think clearly one of the outcomes of the military exercises in August and the tensions in the Strait, I think a lot of concern on the part of Japanese companies, Japanese business, about the impact on supply chains, trade, sort of this economic security agenda. How do you see Japanese companies, Japanese industry adjusting investment patterns, addressing supply chain concerns as being influenced by concern about the possibility of a Taiwan conflict, if at all? I wonder how much that's shaping their thinking about investment patterns going forward. Akita-san, maybe I'll just start with you, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Former Prime Minister Abe once said, Taiwan contingency is a Japanese contingency. And that means that, as I understand, this is my interpretation, and this interpretation is being shared among experts and also to some extent by government officials. That is, if there were to be a war in Taiwan Strait between US and China, US will not be able to conduct military operation unless US will use US military base in Japan. So US will conduct military operation from Japan. And if China wants to stop it, China will be likely to attack US military base in Japan, or at least try to, disrupt. So, this means if China's missile hit US base on Japanese soil, in a second, it will be a war between China and Japan. So, under that scenario, there is no, whether willingly or unwillingly, Japan will engage the war together with the US. So that is one scenario. And another scenario is that more difficult scenario is gray zone scenario. China will blockade Taiwan, or China will launch some hybrid warfare. So under the threshold, under that scenario, still, Japanese Okinawa Islands are so close geographically close to Taiwan. So Japan will be affected. Japanese sea lane will affected. Japanese commerce will affected. So that will quickly evolve to a Japanese crisis for Japan. So there are many other scenarios, and there are many tabletop exercises being conducted among experts that involve some politicians as well in Japan. So I think there is, in short, there is a growing recognition that Japan cannot be away, separate itself from the Taiwan crisis scenario, especially if US will decide to engage the war.
Yeah, the reality of geography is pretty compelling here.
Yeah.
So it's amazing, and I think back when I first started at the Pentagon in 2010, it's very difficult to discuss Taiwan-related matters. Things have changed. Shihoko, what thoughts might you have here?
So very quickly, just two things. We all know that Taiwan is the world's biggest producer of advanced semiconductors. And so we've seen the chip manufacturing capabilities, especially from TSMC going to Japan. That's one immediate impact that we've seen. The other thing is really about the issue of sea lanes. Commercial ties between the commercial cargo that goes through the waters of Taiwan is tremendous and will impact Japan's own logistical stability as well. And we are seeing the great threat that we are seeing is not necessarily a immediate military action intervention by China, or like a blockade, but the potential is salami slice tactic when it comes to disrupting those ceilings. So China says, oh, well, we have to quarantine cargo, or we have to inspect this. We have to hold these consumer goods back in the ports for a month, 2 weeks, whatever. These are things that could actually disrupt a lot of commercial relations and could really impact the logistical side of commerce. So we are seeing a great deal more of contingency planning on the part of businesses as well.
Yeah, I think one consequence of the war in Ukraine, right, is I think, focuses the mind on the reality that conflict is possible. So very interesting. Well, we've come to the end of our time. And I just want to thank you both, Akita-san and Shihoko, very much for participating. As I said up front, this is one of the most consequential times, I think, in Japan's political evolution that I can remember. The policy issues on the plate, the challenges that the government is confronting. Really interesting time in the next few weeks. We'll see some important decisions coming forth. So my deep thanks to you both for sharing your thoughts and insights here today. And also thanks to our online audience for the questions that you submitted along the way that hopefully I got to most of them. But thanks to both of you again, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you.